beginning this tape, I'd like to take a look at a statement that appeared first in the Washington Post, and then one that appeared in Newsweek magazine of March 15th, 1993. The first statement is taken from the Washington Post, March 3rd, 1993. The morning before Easter last year, Shirley Burton, spokeswoman for the Seventh-day Adventist Church, said she got a terrifying phone call. On the line was a church official in Australia, relaying a warning that the next day an explosion of violence would occur in a Waco, Texas cult that included dozens of former Adventists. The man got the warning from parents of a cult member. The parents had just had word that there would be a suicide massacre, Burton said, adding that her mind filled with images of the 1978 murder-suicide of Jim Jones and 900 of his followers in Guyana. Church authorities tipped off Waco police, and Easter passed without incident. But peace came to a bloody end this past Sunday when sect members began a shootout with federal agents. Washington Post, March 3rd, 1993. And then in Newsweek, March 15 of the same year, we read, last spring, officials of the Seventh-day Adventist Church heard from colleagues in Sydney that the Branch Davidians were planning a mass suicide for Easter Sunday. About the same time, the State Department got word from sources in Australia that Koresh's group was stockpiling arms and planning suicide. State passed it on to the ATF, which began its investigation in June. It's very, very interesting then that the target person that tipped off the federal government concerning the people at Waco was the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists in general, and Shirley Burton in particular. And in both articles that we've just quoted from, it's very clear that at least a year prior to the tragedy at Waco, Texas, that we find that the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists told the federal government that there was going to be a mass suicide in Waco, Texas. That suicide never took place. And then it said in the Washington Post, or excuse me, the Newsweek article, that the ATF began to investigate the Branch Davidians in June of 1992. That becomes a very significant and important date, as a little bit later on we're going to see that at that time David Koresh learned that the ATF wanted to get all kinds of information about him in June of 1992. And at that point, David Koresh invited the BATF to come out to the Mount Carmel compound in order to look and see whatever they wanted. Tragically, the ATF, or the BATF, refused to come out. It was 1993, February 28th. The place was Waco, Texas, which it was the location of the Mount Carmel compound of Branch Davidians. At that time, on February 28th, 100 BATF agents stormed the compound to arrest David Koresh. In the melee, or in the situation that developed, 4 BATF agents were killed, 16 were wounded, and 6 Branch Davidians were killed, and many of them were wounded too. The 4 BATF agents that died in Waco on February 28th had all been bodyguards for Bill Clinton prior to their deaths. They had all served as Clinton bodyguards during the Democratic convention and the process whereby Bill Clinton came to the presidency in January of 1993. These 4 BATF agents were the only federal agents to die in the siege at Waco. It's very interesting. In a videotape that was put out in, I believe, 1993 by Linda Thompson, and it was entitled Waco, the Big Lie. Linda Thompson shows footage of 3 of those BATF agents not being killed or shot at by Branch Davidians, but she has footage that shows 3 of those BATF agents going into the compound of the Branch Davidians. And then as they go in through an upstairs window, the BATF agents, as they go into this upstairs window, it then shows the other BATF agent who is out on the roof actually shooting in through the window where those BATF agents had just gone. So 3 of those BATF agents were killed by their own people. Now there's many, many questions that have never been answered that need to be answered in this Waco tragedy. And before I go on, let me just say this. There were many things that the Branch Davidians believed, and still believe, I would gather, that I would totally and completely reject. They believed that one day they would all be gathered together in Israel, and that from there they would ascend to heaven. That belief I categorically reject. The Branch Davidians had other strange doctrines that had to do with the book of Revelation and other portions of Scripture. They also believed in stockpiling weapons and that they would one day be the destroying angel identified in Ezekiel chapter 9. This I also reject. So there are things the Branch Davidians taught that as a Bible-believing Seventh-day Adventist Christian, I completely reject. Nevertheless, there are things that happened at Waco that demand answers that have yet to be answered. Number 1, why did the federal government go to such extremes at Waco, Texas? In 1987, there had been problems at the Mount Carmel compound. There was a shootout over the leadership of the Branch Davidians between David Koresh and his followers and a man by the name of Roden and his followers. 7 Davidians at that time, along with David Koresh, were arrested, indicted, and tried for attempted murder. According to the prosecutor in the case, McLennan County District Attorney Vic Fiazzel, and this is his quote, March 1st, 1993, from the Houston Chronicle. This is what this district attorney had to say about the Branch Davidians. We had no problems. We treated them like human beings. rather than storm-trooping the place. They were extremely polite people. After the trial, although we didn't agree with everything they believed or said, many of the staff were pretty sympathetic with them. The government's action was a vulgar display of power on the part of the feds, being met with fear and paranoia on the part of the Davidians. If the federal government had called and talked to the Davidians would have given them whatever they wanted. Let me cite for you another case, other than the situation in 1987. In an April 21st television interview, this was in 1993, Henry McMahon, who owned a gun shop in Waco, stated this: David Koresh has purchased at least $50,000 worth of firearms. In July of 1992, BATF officers came to McMahon's shop asking about Koresh and his gun purchases. McMahon called David Koresh while the BATF were still in his store. Koresh told McMahon, "If there is a problem, tell them to come out here." McMahon offered to take the BATF agents out to the Mount Carmel compound to see the firearms that Koresh had. But the BATF agents declined. Why then, if David Koresh had been so willing in 1987 to cooperate with the federal government, and then was willing to cooperate with the BATF in 1992, why was it that such extreme measures were taken at the Mount Carmel compound in 1993? I believe towards the end of this broadcast you will see clearly why the government did what they did. A second question that needs to be answered: why wasn't David Koresh arrested peaceably so that no one else was hurt? The BATF claimed that David Koresh was never out where he could be arrested. Paul Fattah, a Branch Davidian who was out on errands when the raid started, made this comment in many press releases: David Koresh, others, and myself have gone jogging down the road 3 miles from the compound. Why wasn't he arrested then? We were off the property several times. Once again, why wasn't Koresh arrested on one of those jogging episodes or when he was about in town? Why did they go to such extremes? Another question: did the Branch Davidians know they were being attacked by federal agents? On a television show called A Current Affair on May 3rd, 1993, David Thibodeau, a Waco survivor, was interviewed. And in this interview, David Thibodeau stated that one of the members of the Branch Davidians, a man by the name of Wayne Martin, a Harvard-trained attorney, called 911 shortly after the federal agents stormed Waco, stormed the compound there at Mount Carmel. Martin called 911, was put through to another agency, And the person said, "Well, hi, boys. How y'all doing out there?" And Wayne Martin screams into the phone, "We're getting shot at. We're getting killed. We're getting killed." All 911 calls are preserved. It therefore seems that it would be easy to confirm this phone call. But as current affair reporter Mary Garofalo stated, it has become a controversial recording that the police refuse to release to the press. The Branch Davidians realized they were being attacked. Wayne Martin said, "We're being killed." And nothing was done about it. Number 4, were the charges of physical or sexual abuse at the Mount Carmel compound valid? The greatest critic of the Branch Davidians was a man by the name of James Thom. He was an ex-Davidian, and James Thom has stated, and I quote, "David Koresh spanked my daughter for 30 to 40 minutes. And Tom, who was standing right there, stated he could not intervene because he thought he would get hurt too. Tom declared that David Koresh is the image of Charles Manson." I think it would behoove us to analyze Tom's comments. Number 1, if David Koresh truly spanked his daughter for 30 to 40 minutes, I can't imagine a father being so afraid that he wouldn't intervene and say, "Stop doing it to her, do it to me if you have to do it to anyone." For Tom also to declare that Koresh was the image of Charles Manson, it would certainly lead one to sit back and ask the question, well, if he was a Charles Manson look-alike, then why did you ever join the Branch Davidians in the first place? From the Houston Post, on about March the 1st, several children were allowed to leave the Mount Carmel compound, 21 to be exact. According to the Houston Post, the 21 children were psychologically in good condition. They were in good condition physically, and they were also very well educated. The facts are that the children that left Mount Carmel were not physically, mentally, morally, or psychologically abused. They were in good condition, well educated, physically and psychologically sound, according to the Houston Post. David Koresh was demonized. He was made out to be some absolute crazy monster. FBI spokesman Bob Ricks stated that David Koresh was a classical sociopath. Attorney General Janet Reno called him a dangerous criminal. Fort Worth News columnist Bill Thompson called him a vile mass murderer. And President William Jefferson Clinton referred to him as dangerous, irrational, and probably insane. As I've already stated, there were things that David Koresh believed that I could not touch with a 10 or 20-foot pole. Nevertheless, David Koresh was demonized by the federal authorities and by the controlled press. And it would lead us to ask the question of why. Why was he made out to be such an awful person when he simply just had some strange ideas? The fifth question that we need to ask ourselves: why were bizarre psychological operations used? During the siege at Waco, there was blaring sounds that were played for a lot of the time. I don't know if it was 24 hours a day, but it was sure going on a whole lot. There were dental drillings being played on tape. There were rabbits being slaughtered. And there was loud rock music. And one of the songs that was being played was one that was made popular by a lady with the name of Nancy Sinatra. And it's called "These Boots Are Made for Walking." And I don't know much of the song, but I do remember two phrases. And one of them said, "These boots are made for walking." And the other one is that someday these boots are going to walk all over you. If the federal government was really there at Waco to try to save the Branch Davidians, they most certainly would not have gone to these extremes in having all of these psycho operations going on. When asked why they were playing these loud sounds of rabbits being slaughtered and music and dental drillings, the answer was given that this might break down all of the people's willingness in the Mount Carmel compound, and it might help them to see that they should not be following what Koresh is saying. But in actuality, when a person's mental capacities are broken down, when they're exhausted because they're not getting enough sleep, as the Branch Davidians were not with all of these loud sounds, the exact opposite would actually occur. Instead of being less likely to follow one person, being exhausted would lead them to more likely follow him. So there was a far different motive behind why these things were being done to the Branch Davidians. Another question that needs to be asked: was the gas that was sprayed in the Mount Carmel compound harmful? The gas that was sprayed into the Mount Carmel compound was CS gas. This gas has been known to cause dizziness, nausea, coughing, and vomiting. According to Congressman Ron Paul from Texas, CS gas has been banned under the Paris Convention on Chemical Warfare. So in the case of a war, the United States could not use CS gas. It is absolutely illegal. But the federal government the BATF and the FBI would use it against their own citizens. Houston Police SWAT Commander Jim Gunn made this statement concerning CS gas. This gas can get into the lungs of a child and cause congestion and kill them. Benjamin Garrett, the Executive Director of Chemical and Biological Arms Control, stated this. This was a quote from the Washington Times, April 23, 1993. The CS gas would have most harshly affected the children. The smaller you are, the sooner you would feel the response. Those who pushed for CS gas to be pumped into the Waco compound had called David Koresh things like dangerous criminal, dangerous, irrational, or probably insane. Very frankly, I think the words that were used to describe David Koresh actually apply better to the people that use them. At this point in our tape, let's turn it over to Side 2, to Behind the Door, Part 10. I'd like to welcome you to Side 2 of our continuing series, and Behind the Door. This is Part 10. We're looking at the Waco massacre of April 19th, 1993. We have listed several questions that demand answers that have never been clearly outlined to the American people, which leads one to believe that there was another reason why Waco took place. What was the aftermath of Waco? We notice May 5th, roughly 2 weeks after the burning of Waco, of the Mount Carmel compound there in Waco, Texas, one John Chaffee, a senator from the state of Rhode Island, called for a new law that would be a nationwide ban on handgun ownership. It would prohibit the sale, possession, importing, and exporting of handguns. So Senator John Chaffee, after the Waco massacre, the massacre at Mount Carmel, called for a ban of handguns. Now, for anybody that is aware of where people in the United States get their freedom to bear arms, they will readily realize that it comes from the Second Amendment of the Bill of Rights in the Constitution of the United States. John Chaffee's attempt to curb the sale of and the holding on to handguns in the United States would be a direct shot at the Second Amendment of our Constitution. We have noticed very, very clearly in other tapes that we have done that there is one power that specifically wants to destroy this freedom that we have as Americans. The Jesuit order, working through the United States government to destroy that document that they have hated from the very inception. The Jesuit order has sought and is seeking today to annihilate the principles and the amendments of our Constitution here in the United States. And it was the Jesuit order that was behind the ATF, the FBI, the man in the White House, and the Attorney General that brought about the destruction and massacre in Waco, Texas, April 19th, 1993. Why they would do this? Of course, they have wanted to destroy the Constitution for so long. But there was another reason why, too, and we'll get to it in just a little while. Other things that occurred after the Waco tragedy, the Spotlight magazine or newspaper declared that Vince Foster became so disturbed by what happened at Waco that he decided he was going to expose the entire operation to the American people. And before he could, Vince Foster was killed, syndicate style. Vince Foster was murdered, and his body was then taken to that park in Washington, D.C., Fort Macy Park, I believe it was called. That was not only stated by the Spotlight newspaper, but also Gordon Norvell also stated the exact same thing. And Gordon Norvell was a personal friend of the former CIA director Bill Colby, who was also murdered. I believe there was another reason for Waco. I found it in a press release that was put out April 20th, 1993, from the White House Press Secretary website. This was an interview with the press in the Rose Garden, April 20th, 1993, with Bill Clinton and the press. This was what Bill Clinton said. Again, I want to say, as I did yesterday, I am very sorry for the loss of life which occurred at the beginning and at the end of this tragedy in Waco. I hope very much that others who will be tempted to join cults and to become involved with people like David Koresh will be deterred by the horrible scenes they have seen over the last 7 weeks. And I hope very much that the difficult situations which federal agents confronted there, and which they will be doubtless required to confront in other contexts in the future, will be somewhat better handled and better understood because of what has been learned now. Now let's analyze what the then president just stated the day after the massacre at Waco. Bill Clinton said, "I hope that what people saw with the massacre at Waco, that this would keep other people from joining cults and becoming involved with people like David Koresh. Now, I think we're all aware that following the massacre at Waco, all of the independent ministries were being styled as cultic, and they were all looked at as David Koresh-like. And so the massacre at Waco was a warning against anybody who would dare to separate from a mainline, mainstream denomination and to join up with an independent group. The fact that the Branch Davidians were former Seventh-day Adventists, and the fact that there are independent Seventh-day Adventist groups that are preaching the three angels' messages to the four corners of the earth, I believe that Waco was a warning to any Seventh-day Adventist who would break away from the denomination and who would become a part of an independent ministry. Bill Clinton also said in the Rose Garden that the federal agents who confronted the problem at Waco will doubtless be required to confront in the future similar situations. Now, Bill Clinton is a part of the CFR, the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderbergers, and those groups get together and plan years ahead of time what they're going to do. And Bill Clinton and his people have already gotten together and planned out what they are going to do to the true and faithful Seventh-day Adventist Christian. Now, concerning cultic groups, you say, well, I don't believe that Bill Clinton was talking about Seventh-day Adventists at all. Well, that's fair. Why don't we read from the Attorney General, the former Attorney General of the United States, Janet Reno, and let's hear what her picture of a cult is. This was taken from an interview on 60 Minutes, June 26, 1994. Janet Reno stated, "A cultist is one who has a strong belief in the Bible and the second coming of Christ, who frequently attends Bible studies, who has a high level of financial giving to a Christian cause, who homeschools for their children, who has accumulated survival food, and has a strong belief in the Second Amendment, and who distrusts big government." Any of these may qualify a person as a cultist, but certainly more than one of these would cause us to look at this person as a threat and his family as being in a risk situation that qualified for government interference. Now, how many of those characteristics of a cult do you fit into? Do you believe in the Bible and the second coming? Do you attend Bible study and give financially to Christian causes? Do you homeschool? Do you accumulate survival food? Do you believe in the Second Amendment and distrust big government. At least 7 out of 8 of those apply to me. How about you? That is a cultist in the eyes of Bill Clinton and Janet Reno and the Jesuit order. And Waco shows us what the Jesuit order is planning for Seventh-day Adventists, Christians that are true and faithful. Now, from the spotlight of November 8th, 1993, we read these words. The new director of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the BATF, says that his agents are readying themselves for action similar to what occurred at the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas. John McGaugh told a congressional subcommittee, "We are aware of similar groups and situations in other places. The BATF has been harshly criticized for its disastrous raid on the complex in Waco, which resulted in the deaths of 4 agents and 10 members of the sect. An FBI assault nearly 2 months later killed 85 Davidians, 24 of them children." So the head of the BATF told the congressional subcommittee that there are other groups out there just like the Davidians that have broken away from the mainstream church, that they're watching. I received a letter from a colporteur, independent colporteur up in the Northwest, the Midwest, who stated that a little over a week ago, I was on the phone talking to a friend of mine who works at a Seventh-day Adventist academy in Georgia. He had just a few days earlier been to a worship talk by one of the conference officials. In that worship talk, he told about 2 BATF agents who had just been at the conference office. The conference was helping them locate the Davidians and the independents in the area. This is horrifying. Anyone who has been following the Spotlight newspaper knows that the Waco incident was nothing but criminal mass murder by the BATF. Friends, the Jesuit order that controls the federal government of the United States, the FBI, the ATF, the White House, the Congress, the Supreme Court, is all waiting to carry out on independent Seventh-day Adventists what happened at Waco. You and I can read from the book by Malachi Martin in The Keys of This Blood, where he says that the provincial globalists, of whom Seventh-day Adventists are a part, will go through a series of severe shocks in order to help them assimilate into the New World Order. However, if they do not, then they will go through some very harsh times which will inevitably lead to their extinction. Those were the words of Malachi Martin in his book, and I'm paraphrasing, from his book, The Keys of This Blood. Malachi Martin, who was a part of the Insiders, he was a former Jesuit, I believe he still was when he died, but Malachi Martin made it very, very clear, because the Jesuits know exactly what they're planning to do. But in God's own time, God and He alone will allow certain things to happen. But until He does, He is going to propel and strengthen His people to spread His message, the three angels of Revelation 14, as far and wide as possible. As one person said to me recently, Bill, you are immortal until God says otherwise. And I understood exactly what she meant. Nobody anywhere will touch any of us until God says so.